Sorry, I'm just getting myself organized, and my partner for this Sunday morning session has not yet joined us. I wanted to talk about a few things this morning, and he has said that he has some things about Ezra Pound to talk about, so I'm looking forward to that. And I am following the chat, so if you have questions, please feel free to ask them, and I will do my best to answer. So as you may have noticed on this YouTube channel, over the last week, I have begun to read a book called Alchemy by Louise von France. And this is a truly profound book. I have to admit that I have avoided it for more than 3 decades. I've read Dr. Jung's book called Psychology and Alchemy, which is this book. This is volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. It's quite a tome, as you can see, and it's a very important book. But in order to understand alchemy in context, I really feel that you need to take a look at Dr. von France's book, which is this one. Okay. Alchemy. And, because it pulls together a lot of the threads that Dr. Jung was pulling on through his career. And I've found some truly profound things, so profound that I have felt compelled to read the book into the YouTube channel. So I've done the first 3 segments of that. Perhaps I'll do the 4th segment today. I'm going to blast right through it. It's a 270-page book. And so far, I'm on about, well, I'm not too far along yet. I'm at page 45, I guess. But I've read ahead, and I know what's coming in chapter 5, which is very important to know, especially if you're a young man. And so you could do that if you bought the book and read it yourself. It's easy to understand. And what we see in her book is that she talked about alchemy in 3 contexts. In the context of the Greeks, and the Greeks got their alchemy mainly from the Egyptians. And then in the context of the Arabs, all this information kept flowing around the world, of course, over hundreds of years. In those days, it took hundreds of years for it to propagate across the world. Nowadays, we can have a good idea and propagate our information in minutes. But for most of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, or even longer, 7,000 years, people didn't have much information, and so they had to believe what they were told. And so now we can look at all the information and all the primitiveness of the alchemists and all those things and understand what they were trying to drive at. So I'm going to look at the chat here. Due to the question, due to the ambiguity of Jung's use of the term ambiguity, who has since used it or explained it further, and or who has developed new terms of a similar concept? Sorry, I meant archetype, he says. And one says Marie Louise has a book on fairy tales and about the shadow and evil. Yes, also very good. In fact, the Chiron Publications now has permission to publish all of the collected works of Marie Louise von Franz, which, as I understand it, will be a 28-volume series, of which the third volume was just published. I've started to buy this series, although it's hard to know why I'm doing it, but it's very good. I mean, the first three issues or volumes of the series are about fairy tales, and the third volume is about individuation among women, which I'm sure is very good. I just haven't had the time to look at it. Now, going back to Dharma Hum's question, people have been talking about archetypes, and probably new archetypes in many ways, for a couple thousand years. And one of the things that we have to recognize, and I think I have a good quote on that, which I can share with you, is that the people that had the knowledge used it to get paid, basically. And so let's see here. Sorry, I can't find. So the church knew these things, I'm fairly certain, but they didn't bother to tell anybody. They just went about their own way. And so here's the quote that I think is most relevant. And Jung said it only one time. And he did not put this headline in it. And he did not put the material I put in brackets in it, but here's what he says. And so I said in my headline, theologians and psychologists are in the same business. Quote, for thousands of years, the mind of man was worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul, and its salvation, these are not yesterday's problems. Religions are, and I added naturally evolved, psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. Okay, so I think that that's a pretty important quote, because it basically said that religious people understood that the issue was really within us, and probably the issue related to denial of death. A famous writer of the 20th century, Dr. Ernest Becker, wrote a book called Denial of Death, and it's a very powerful book. And the reason it is because it says what really drives us at base, at the very base. And what really drives us is the fear of death, the knowledge that we will die and what will happen to us. Now, so the religions gave us hope, gave us hope by offering eternal heaven, let's say, um, hanging out in the clouds with harps with our departed loved ones. And that sounded pretty good to people who were primitive in their perspective on life. And so people were happy to go to church every week and pay their tithe so that they could hear more of this magical thinking. The problem is that heaven is not out there. The heaven that we're talking about is here. Okay, and this has been known for thousands of years. The early alchemists knew it. There are many diagrams that demonstrate that we know that the rivers that bring the necessary knowledge into our heads are here and here and here and here. And so we experience things over time and make our own judgments about them. And so, you know, strictly speaking, the stories of all religions, when they put God or any religious figure outside of us, those are myths, but they're not in the physical sense that we know the physical sense today true. But they are true. They are absolutely true in another sense, and that is, for example, the immortality of first the Buddha, and then and at about the same time as the Buddha lived, Job in the Bible, and then at the time of Christ, Jesus Christ and John the Baptist. These were all people who knew something about how the psyche works, and they would talk about it in a certain way. Now, this got amplified over many years. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea, which is in present-day Turkey or Syria, I can't remember which. I think the present-day Turkey, where the contents of the Bible were agreed to by the fathers of the church at that time. And of course, in modern times, there's a lot of controversy about leaving out certain passages of the Bible, including the Book of Thomas as an example. But nonetheless, they established what the teachings of the church would be. Now, in terms of 325 years, this is when they were putting the Bible together. What do you remember that happened 325 years ago? Even if you studied it in a history class somewhere, what do you remember? Can you say, okay, at about 325 years ago, X happened, and that justifies everything that I know now. And so there was obviously a development over many years. And so the church and the people who were ministers of the church developed a way that they could have a profession, be paid to serve up these myths. And so in terms of the myth of the immortality or of Jesus Christ, or the rising of Christ and the Virgin Mary into heaven, well, yes, of course, those are true, but they're true in the psychological sense. In other words, that the only place that they can exist, which is what Dr. Jung points out, is that They are within our psyche. We can't know anything without our psyche. And now, because of the Enlightenment that's been going on for over 500 years, we know that they're not up there, and they're not, and the devil is not down there. We know that in the physical world, but in the spiritual world, they very much do exist. And so, a quarter of the world's population is Buddhist, and they believe in the teachings of Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who basically sat under a tree for 80 years of his life and promulgated 84,000 teachings. And those teachings are the basis of the Buddhist religion. Only about 5% of them have been translated into the English language, which is a terrible shame. But there is a project now called 84,000. My wife used to work for it. And their objective is to translate all the teachings of the Buddha. And that will be a multi-generational task, obviously. And many of these teachings exist only in Tibetan Buddhism now, because the Buddhists were actually a heresy of Hinduism. And so they were forced up into the Himalayas. They ultimately ended up in Tibet. And the tradition was carried on by Tibetan monks, and it also traveled in other ways. It traveled to Japan through China, and so there's a Chinese version of Buddhism. There's a Japanese version of Buddhism. All these things are more or less the same, and they have great meaning to people. Well, we can, if I pull up one of my favorite teachers here. Whoops, push the wrong button here. All right, so this statue is the statue of Kuan Yin, or in Japan, it's called Kannon. This is the goddess of mercy. And so when people are upset in their psyche about loved ones who have passed, they pray to Kuan Yin, because she was known for having gone to hell and redeemed the souls of people who have been lost because of some sin. Now, this particular statue, which I saw every day for my whole high school career, is very soothing. I found it very soothing when I would see it. But its actual purpose is to redeem the souls of the Japanese soldiers who gave their lives during World War II. And so she gave grace and peace to the families of the men who had lost their lives during World War II. And this statue was actually completed about 1 month before I arrived in Japan in 1962. I found her quite soothing for various reasons. And Christ does the same thing, of course, in the Apocrypha of having descended into hell, and he harrowed hell and found the souls that ought to be redeemed and taken to heaven when he went to heaven. And this doesn't mean that there was a physical function. It was actually a psychological way of having people deal with it. And there's another famous shrine to Kannon, Kuan Yin, in Japan, in Kamakura, where I lived. It's called Hase Kannon. And there you find many small dolls that are put into the cliff and the mountain of Hase Kannon, and they are put there by women who have had abortions, and they are praying. The women pray for the redemption of the soul of their unborn child who they've aborted. And I can't say how it soothes their conscience, but it does. And so anyway, the symbolism of these things are, of course, excruciating, but they also soothe our conscience. And so what's in the Bible is actually true. Partially historically, it's true. I'm sure there was a historical person called Abraham, and there's a historical person called Moses and Job, for example, and they wrote down what their teachings were. And the result of that was that those teachings have been passed down through thousands of years. And today, 3 of the world's major religions point back to that time, to Abraham, and they are Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And so that represents more than half of the world community. And another quarter of the world community is Hindu. And so they follow a different path, but toward the same thing. They do the same thing psychologically. And, in every case, the ministers of those churches, created a profession which let them survive, let them beg, or whatever it was. In Buddhism, the tradition was begging. In Christianity, it was tithing. And I presume that there are systems within Judaism and Islam that do the same thing. But all of those, let's see, Dr. Fell says, or she is only an archetype. And I can't get back to everything, I guess, but the question of Dr. Fell is whether Canon Kuan Yin actually existed as an individual. I suspect probably not. I don't know. She may have been a story that was told in early China, and that story is archetypal, and therefore it worked. It soothed people's minds. So let's presume that she was not an actual person, although she might well have been. Certainly, saints like Jeanne d'Arc were actual people who actually did things. But let's suppose that she was not. Maybe she was a story that was made up. Well, these stories have a way of doing what was necessary to develop civilization. And so a good example that I can give you is why cows are holy in India. Okay, the reason that there are holy cows in India, and all cows are holy, is because 2,000 years ago, people were tending to slaughter the cows and eat them for meat. And the result of that was that there was not enough nutrition for the children of India, the human children of India. And so, which would be in the form of milk. And so the priesthood of those days came together and created a series of myths which said that the cow was holy or divine and couldn't be killed. And so that's why many Indians today are vegetarian, and it's why cows are left alone in India. The owners just put them out on the street in the morning, and they go away and they forage for what they can find to eat, and then they come back and the owners milk them, which is the traditional way to control cattle, or milk cattle anyway, which even American dairy farmers use to this day. They put the cows out in pastures where they can eat grass, and then when their udders are filled, the cows come back because the farmers milk them and relieve them of the milk. So anyway, I'm getting a little bit off the track here, but we'll see if my friend comes and gives me a cue. But anyway, but archetypes are real. The point is, as Dr. Jung pointed out, everything that we know is here. It's in the psyche. And if there wasn't consciousness of that fact, then for all intents and purposes, it would not exist. So all of the creatures of the world have evolved over hundreds of millions of years. And for our lights, they might as well never have existed, because none of them were ever conscious of the fact that they were living on a planet in the solar system, in the universe. None of them ever knew anything about that. And it was only with the development of human beings that this knowledge started to emerge. Now, of course, there is the consciousness of how to survive. And so our ancestors, as well as the ancestors of all species, have done two things without fail. And those are, they survived until they reproduced. Two things. And so, the essence of the secret of alchemy, which Dr. von Franz talks about in this book, in this alchemy book, is that the great secret was lion begets lion, giraffe begets giraffe, human being begets human being. And so, we don't, human beings don't deliver a giraffe when they mate. And so that is the way the natural world works. And so they were pointing to that fact. And so the alchemists in their early days were trying to understand what matter meant. Okay, so they put various substances together and got certain results. few of them probably got blown up in the process. But they could see, and they developed over a 1700-year period that we can point to. They started to find that if you mix one thing with another, then you could have a third thing. And that was the basis of the science of chemistry, the origin of the science of chemistry, which after the Enlightenment went off on this chemistry siding, let's say, because chemists use the scientific method, which is to hold everything constant except one thing and see if you change it, what happens. And so the alchemists were really doing that for 1700 years. But then there came a time when the Enlightenment, which was really the Endarkenment, found that certain things didn't exist in the physical world, as the church knew probably forever. Even Jesus Christ knew it, and even Job knew it, but that these things are within the psyche. And so no one can say that Jesus Christ is not immortal. He certainly is immortal, because a quarter of the world's population points to him and no other. And the same with the Buddha, and the same with the founder of Jainism, and the same with Krishna and all of the Indian gods. They all did various things for the people. Let's see. Yeah, Dharma is correct that these developments over time created more discussion, more involution, and then the scientific method came along and debunked everything, because they said if you can't touch it and you can't demonstrate through a scientific experiment that it's true, then it's not true. But that's not true, because the psyche is very real, and we all have our psyches. And if we didn't have them, we wouldn't know anything. And so so they're quite real. And even if whether they physically existed, whether the myths physically existed in the cosmos or not, they certainly existed in the psyche of the people of that time and in that culture. Let's see. So Dharma says, not sure if you can derive archetype from priesthood operations. The archetype of dreaming and animal divination arises in indigenous people in Australian and Native North American without a priest class. Well, that's not true, because the priest class was the shamans, and most people were they were all primitive, and they lived in a primitive way, but they all pointed to a medicine man or somebody like that. So those were certainly the priest class, and their traditions, the stories that they told, gained power and credibility. And so, Dr. Fell, there is nothing that is only an archetype. The archetypes are those psychic aspects that direct our lives. And so archetypes are quite real, and we ignore them at our peril. And so, yeah, and so archetypes also arise in all kinds of cultures, no doubt about it. And what is true about an archetype is carried on. What is not true falls away. And that's part of what Dr. Von Franz is talking about in her Alchemy book. And yes, you definitely have to know how they operate. And, you know, that's what, that has been sort of my calling for decades now, and in the sense that I'm not trying to debunk archetypes, and I'm not trying to debunk any religion either. I think that they're all true as far as they go. And I think that, you know, they're all the religions are working toward mental health in their communities, and they have largely succeeded. But at the same time, they've also been used for improper purposes, for the power devil and keeping people in power and that sort of thing. And these political purposes of religion play out over centuries. It takes centuries for people to understand that this is, if you go to church and you have what Dr. Jung called the charisma of belief, then that will help you deal with the mental issues. But if you don't have the charisma of belief, then, as Dr. Jung said, then you have to have an understanding of psychology and how things work. And yes, they work in a behavioral way in some instances, but you know, what are the instincts that are being, let's say, advanced by those behaviors? And you know, who's using it for power and who isn't? Those are the questions. So Dr. Fellow says, I asked if she existed in real form. Well, by real form, that suggests you're suggesting that it in the physical world, and in that I don't know. But in terms of whether she is real and exists in the psychological sense, yes, she's very real. You saw the statue that the Japanese built after World War II. And that statue is very sacred, not only to me, and she was very healing for me during my high school career, but she was very healing for the Japanese people who had lost at least one generation of young men in the war. And so that's quite real. Thank you for the Cal explainers. That is so believable to protect the resources. And he says he's obsessed with understanding the pleroma. It's his thing. Well, Dr. Edinger talks about the pleroma in the Ion Lectures, in his book called The Ion Lectures. And I would urge you to look at that, because that does explain the pleroma. And I'm not going to explain it in great detail now, but these are basically pairs of opposites that emerge from one another in a certain way over millions of years, and are, were identifiable, and therefore they started to be canonized, let's say. They were written down. And so those pairs of opposites, one leads to another pair of opposites, and so on. It's the fundamental story of alchemy, which is expressed by the theorem of Maria Prophetessa from the 3rd century, which is 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, and 3 becomes 4, and that becomes 1 again. And a very simple way of understanding that is, if you're a man, unless you're gay, you're going to be attracted to a woman. And so your life is originally just one person, but you, by instinct and by the instincts of all your ancestors who survived until they reproduced, you are going to look for a woman in your life. And so you find a woman, and one thing leads to another, and you have a baby. That's the 3rd thing. And so now you have a baby, which is the 3rd thing. But you also have a 4th thing now, which is family, a family. And so once you have a family, then that goes back to being a one thing again. And so once you have a family, that leads to the next thing in your life. And so that's the way alchemy works everywhere and always, that it's a way of understanding how things interact with one another. And so it's actually as simple as that. And let's see. Okay, well, and when I have no idea whether Jesus Christ would take the vaccine, and I can tell you that the Dalai Lama does believe in science and in modern medicine. And while he was, for many years, he was a vegetarian, but at some point his doctors told him that he had to have more protein in his diet. And so he did change his attitude about being a vegetarian, and therefore he's still alive at age 85. And Dr. Fell says, I wonder if Jesus even really existed, or if he is only an archetype with an amazing story. His story among the Gnostics is a beautiful thing, and how it relates to the self in Jungian psychology. Well, certainly he lives in the psyche, and he is immortal in the psyche of a quarter of the world's population. There's no question about that. He's a living entity in all Christians' psyches, including mine. But as to whether he physically lived or was a narrative that had legs, I don't know. And my partner Tim Holmes, the sculptor, had posited in around 1990 a furtherance of the story, which was the returning of the nails. And it's just it's a continuation of the narrative, but let me give you an example of that. Um, I'll just show it to you. And it comes down to my mother's old dictum that, when somebody said, "Oh, that's not true, Grandma," and she would say, "Well, if it's not true, it ought to be." Okay, so here's Tim. Okay, in this, I hope you can hear me now. In this sculpture, Tim was researching early metallurgy, and he realized that iron was a strategic material at the time of Jesus. And it came to his mind that someone whose son was crucified would have to return the nails to the authorities. And he expressed that to me in a postcard that was on the back side of a postcard that he sent to me. And he says, it said that after Tiananmen Square massacre, the Chinese government sent bills to the families of the protesters for the cost of their execution. Whether this is true or not, this is the cast of human evil. In researching early metallurgy, I discovered that in Christ's time, iron was a strategic material. I imagine if nails were used for crucifixions, the families of the victims would be charged with returning the nails to the government. This image is Mary post-crucifixion. And so this is Tim's amplification of the narrative of the period immediately after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, with Mary returning the nails to the authorities. Now, to me, whether true or not, we don't know. There's no biblical reference to this, but it certainly is true in Tim Holmes's mind, because he's actually done two very powerful sculptures on this topic. And because he had this idea 30 years ago, that idea now can be expressed in psychological circles and Christian circles probably too, because it represents the nails being the representation of the logos. Everything that's in your room, that's a physical object and not a living being, is part of the logos, and that includes your Bible. Your Bible is just a black doorstop unless you or a pastor puts life into it. And nails are, innocuous. We have them in all of our living spaces, and they put our life together. But in this context, they represent the logos, and the arrows is where we've gone wrong over the last 2,000 years, because we've believed this story that everything has to be demonstrated physically in order to be real. And it certainly does not, because we actually live our lives entirely in the arrows. Everything in your room that's not a living being is dead. It's not a physical thing. And or it is a physical thing, but it's not a living thing, with the exception of you. Only you are alive. And so that's the point that I've been making now for some years. Okay, so hi, Art. Nice to see you today. Now let me go back. And so Dr. Fell, yes, certainly Christ is an archetype, no doubt. And whether he lived or not doesn't matter, because he does live in the psyche of a quarter of the world's populations. Let's see. Okay, so Dharmaham says, belief is a sacred tool to be kept safe from the culture of the individual. Jung is quite fruitless. To think about the pleroma for this would be self-dissolution. Well, Dharmaham, you, because of the handle that you're using, I would suggest that you're speaking from a Buddhist perspective, and Jung is not fruitless at all. He's taught us how the psyche works, and there is a science around how the psyche works, and it's far beyond what you can prove. And so, there's a great scene in the movie Contact where Matthew McConaughey wants to demonstrate this to Jodie Foster, and he simply asks her, "Do you love your mother?" And she says, "Of course." And he says, "Prove it." Okay, and the point is, you can't prove. There are things that can't be proven. I saw Neil deGrasse Tyson once talking on a video about the first time that he went to see Carl Sagan, who was his mentor at Cornell University. And he came to the door, and it was a truly numinous moment. And he saw Carl Sagan on the door and realized that, the rest of his life was going to articulate out from that moment. And so he can describe the moment to us, but for him to express what that moment really meant to him over the last 40 years of his career, let's say, would take encyclopedias, and he could never finish it, is what I would argue. And so that's what I mean by eros in life. There's some things that you just can't articulate, and so religions have given us tools to articulate certain factors that occur in the psyche. And okay, those myths have, many of them have been proven to be untrue now. I mean, we now have the Hubble, soon to be the James Webb Space Telescope, so we can point back to the Big Bang. And we have electron microscopes that can go down and look at matter at the subatomic level, at the quark level. But we had to build a machine that is 17 miles in circumference in order to get the Higgs boson. And so we have now proved, great, that the Higgs boson exists. But, is God in a Higgs boson? Well, not exactly, because the God image, as Dr. Jung referred to a God, lives within us, and it articulates in 7.5 or 8 billion ways. It doesn't articulate in one way. And so as each of us climb the ladder of consciousness, some have chosen the Christian path, Some have chosen the Buddhist path, some have chosen the Hindu path, and some have chosen the Muslim path. But they all lead to the same thing, which is that we have a psyche that is real and needs to have some structure in order to understand our world. And good morning, Nancy. Nice to see you today. And Thor says Jesus was mentioned in a Roman letter, so he did exist. Well, okay, yeah, that might be a proof that he existed. And Dr. Phil says, oh, that's interesting about the iron and the nails. Yes, I think it can be proven that Jesus did exist and is an archetype as well. So my point about Tim's story, which has driven him to make these two very profound sculptures, is that if that idea were to catch on, then people would understand the significance of the logos and the eros, because Mary is literally saying to the Roman authorities, here are your nails, you can keep them in the physical world. I will carry the future with me, with my son, who is going to continue to live in spirit, and which he does live in a quarter of the human race in spirit. And that can't be denied. And it's true of many other famous people, obviously. Beethoven is still immortal in existence, and he probably exists in all of your psyches as well. So, if all I have to do is mention his name, and all of you will think bum 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 bum, which is the opening of the Fifth Symphony, because we've all heard that opening of the Fifth Symphony. And the same is true of rock bands. Many rock bands have things, some more archetypal and memorable than others, but if you can hear them, they become immortal, and they definitely exist in our psyches. So, I can, for my generation, I can certainly point to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and on the cover of that, the Beatles put, I don't know, about 50 people. Two of them were Freud and Jung. And so, just from that one song and that album, both Freud and Jung are immortal and continue to live. And if you listen, if you're too young to remember the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, if you pick up a record, which is how one way we can store information, then you too can get into what they're talking about. And we have Paul Simon and the 59th Street Bridge song. And if I just mention those things, if you know anything about Paul Simon, you probably can hum the song. And so those things do exist. They do exist, and you can't deny them. Yeah, they're obviously there are lots of mental health issues, and I'm not going to get into inflation and those things, but I concur that for the gay community, another person of the opposite sex is not necessary to achieve psychological wholeness. They find psychological wholeness with a person of the same sex. But the reason that they still and will always be a minority is because the way we reproduce isn't that. And so their experience of life and wholeness is different from the life and experience of people who are of the opposite gender. And it's only the people of the opposite gender who do reproduce. And so that's just the way it is. Okay, let's see. So the reconciliation of the opposites, we need to strive toward wholeness or oneness. And that means that we have to integrate the opposites into our lives. And one can get into a lot of trouble if you do not follow the experience of culture. So some of my colleagues are having a discussion about this Marine Lieutenant Colonel who spoke out about accountability for the way the Afghan exodus was accomplished last month. And his problem is that in the Marine Corps, in the culture of the Marine Corps, in that context, he may not do that. That is taking a political position. And of course, as a human being, he can take that position, but he has to be prepared to face the consequences, which he obviously is prepared. And so he is facing the consequences, and he was immediately relieved of his command as battalion commander because his position cannot exist in the culture of the Marine Corps. The question is, what is the Marine Corps? The Marine Corps is a weapon that belongs to the President of the United States. And if you're, how would you build your sword? Would you build it with iron and steel and a lot of pounding, or would you try to build it with a lot of discussion and irritation about current events? And you can't build a weapon that way. And so within the culture of the Marine Corps, it can't be allowed to continue. But within our common culture, sure, he can take a position as long as he's willing to accept the consequences, which he obviously was. And so more power to him. He's falling on his sword to make a point. And as long as he's prepared to face the consequences, which he knew what they would be in advance, obviously, he from my point of view, he's fine, but he can't remain as a serving battalion commander in the Marine Corps, because that's not what the Marine Corps is. The Marine Corps is a strictly logos operation, and we know where everybody stands in the pecking order by what they wear on their clothes, by insignia of rank, and by decorations. We can both know where that person is in the pecking order vis-a-vis us, and also we know the full resume of the person that we're talking to, because the decorations represent a resume of experience, and so that's very clear at every level in the armed forces. And it must be that way. It must, because if you give everybody the right to have an opinion up and down the line, then you don't have a very effective sword. So that's the thing. Let's see. What is this enormous tragedy of the dream? Well, I mean, the reconciliation of opposites, that's what we're called to do now in the United States, because various people have been forcing us to these extreme positions of red and blue, and the United States as a culture and as a country can't continue to exist in that form. And so we need to evolve it in some way so that those positions can come together. And it's not a question of, the followers of our former president getting control and then just ordering the rest of us to be a certain way, as they would certainly do, because that would not be acceptable to a lot of other Americans. So the task we have in the United States is to find how we can make this conjunctio, the combination between the two sides, that can live effectively. And of course, that's what the United States has done in a very messy way, but that's the way we are as human beings. We're messy, and we only learn by, we're basically, all knuckle draggers until we pound together and we pound the impurities out of our system. And that's what's always been happening since the beginning of the colonies, let's say, not only the United States itself, but the colonies before the United States existed. And, every time we make a mistake, we pay for it. We get killed or something happens that causes us to develop in a certain way. I mean, my first ancestor in the United States came in 1625, which was almost exactly 150 years before the Revolution. And the man who is the patriarch of our family had 3 sons, and one of those sons was killed by Native Americans. And the reason he was killed by Native Americans is he was trying to improperly take something that was not his. And that caused a brief war in the New Amsterdam colony in about 1650 or so. So he made a mistake of trying to just grab something that he wanted, and he paid the price for it. But the rest of his two brothers and his father and mother all were involved in the founding of the New Amsterdam colony, and Rensselaerwyck, which was a part of it. And they survived until old age. And so anyway, I digress. Yeah, Dharma, I think you need to unpack your statement a bit, because you say that the afterlife was true or a lie. Is important hope for the hunted, gutted man. Okay, well, I mean, what are you saying there? What I can say is that the myth has proven to be true. It was not a lie. It is not a lie when Mary returns the nails, and I can't say whether that event actually occurred or not. It may have only occurred in Tim Holmes's psyche 30 years ago, but nonetheless, the idea of it is extremely powerful. And so, we have to decide what's real and what's not. And I think that particular myth or narrative that Tim put forward, even though he may not have fully understood it himself, nor do I, at the time, is true. And the point is, you can have your nails, you can have your physical world, you can have your logos, but Mary carried the future with her, and with the other Christians that were alive at that time. And because that story had legs, it's not a lie, it's true. It was happening in the psyches of the early Christians at that time. And it certainly had legs, so much so that we have churchmen in 325 that decided to codify the Bible. But Tim's narrative, his myth, is true. It has legs in my psyche. And I think a lot of people that hear it think that, it's true that, you can return the nails to the authorities because, your spirit is going to live on in a different way. Big Cat says, so if you are not famous, have no children, and no one remembers you, you are dead. So we should all strive for fame to ensure our immortality. Well, it's up to you, Big Cat. But if you have children, you carry on in that way. And all of my ancestors are immortal because I'm the living proof that all of them did the two things that they had to do. They survived until they reproduced. Now, some of them were were Dutchmen who were Calvinists. They were Protestants, and they didn't like the story that the Catholic Church was promulgating, and so they had pulled away from the Catholic Church 100 years before they came to North America. And what was Martin Luther protesting? He was protesting the sale of indulgences, which we can do that today in terms of the last administration and how that administration basically sold rights to things, and that is an anathema idea to most of us, but there was the former governor of Illinois who tried to sell the Senate seat of Barack Obama, and he ended up in jail because of it. And it remains to be seen what will happen with him in the long term. But the reality is, even though he was, I think, pardoned finally by our former president, that's the way they want to conduct the government, is by being able to be corrupt and sell indulgences, just the same as the Catholic Church. And we had a revolution about that. That sort of thing. And so there will be forces in the world that will try to reinstitute that, but ultimately they can't succeed. That's his lesson of history. Let's see. Yeah, and Dr. Fell says you can see figures becoming archetypal like Einstein, Tesla, and Jung. And, of course, and, remains to be seen whether they will be different archetypes or the same archetype. I think these archetypes are always developing, and how they reach the most powerful existence is a long-term process. So, for example, the most powerful archetype is the archetype of mother. And, once you're a mother, you're a mother. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's your being. And all of us have a mother, and all of us have an emotional connection to our mother, one way or another. And so there's no question that the archetype of mother exists, even though it has been articulated in many profound ways over the whole existence of living species on this planet. Let's see. And Dharma says, being a bang, not with a whimper. Okay, Dharma is trying to get to the Ezra Pound piece and cantos. And I would like to get to those, but I don't want to do it without my counterpart, Jordan. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue since we've now burned off an hour and a half of this discussion. I'm going to hold the peace and cantos for the future, but what Pound was talking about it in terms of the twice crucified was Benedetto Mussolini and his mistress, who were first killed by Italian partisans at the end, or in 1943, and then they were hung up by their heels in a gas station, I guess it was, in Milan, and then they were killed again. And so that's twice crucified. So, one could say that Christ is constantly being crucified by people who aren't followers of Christ. So he's twice crucified, and this is what Pound was saying there, most probably. And then he quotes again, "Yet say this to the possum." And the possum is T.S. Eliot, who Pound helped profoundly early in his career. And so he's saying, he's making a point to him, and then and the reason is that T.S. Eliot, in one of his poems, it was probably The Wasteland, had said that the world would end. The question was whether the world would end with a bang or a whimper, and so from Pound's point of view, being a prisoner accused of treason, he was, during the time he was writing the Peace and Cantos, he was a prisoner of the U.S., having been captured in Italy. He had been indicted for treason, and but he was fundamentally a poet, and so he was making a point that, from his point of view, and based on the experience with Mussolini, that the world would end with a bang and not a whimper. That was a part of that canto. Okay. Irma says, this liquid is certainly a property of the mind, and element in the mind's makeup, dust to the fountain pen otherwise. Well, yeah, I mean, the brain is, the physical brain, and, the part that, the coroner will examine. If you die of untoward circumstances, they'll remove your brain and look at it, and it certainly physically has certain features to it, but it will. But a coroner is never going to be able to understand what the psyche was in that brain. It's just in a different world altogether. Well, Dr. Fowle, I think it's fair to say that Jung was not the discoverer of archetypes. He is one that made archetypes understandable to others, and understood that there were many, not only one. And, his point is that Freud did discover one archetype, the Oedipus complex. And we see that complex appear in modern life, where children fail to launch and they're living in their father's basement or mother's basement, and they haven't left home. So those are people who want to return to the mother, to the family. Freud put a sexual connotation on it, but, the Oedipus complex and archetype certainly exists, and Jung credited Freud for that, but Freud's perspective was incredibly narrow compared to what Dr. Jung opened up. And I wouldn't say that that all the archetypes are not necessarily discovered, as you correctly say. The archetypes of Einstein, Tesla, and Christ are quite different in some ways, and so maybe they do deserve a separate classification and discussion. But whether they be one or many isn't really the issue here. We don't really care about that. Yeah. Yeah, and so Dharma is pointing out that Pound brought to our attention many things in his poetry, and so as far as I can find, one professor, Forrest Reed, has written this book, and it's called One World. It's called 76, One World in the Cantos of Ezra Pound. And his point basically in this book, very simply, is that we're living out an archetypal experience, which is the evolution of culture and society. And he's a part of that and has been a part of that. And he shows through the cantos that there are many parallels to Odysseus. And, he's very complex, but if you were to read this book, by Forrest Reed, let's see, his name is here, Forrest Reed, you would understand the history of the world, because he's unpacked it for you. Pound didn't unpack it for you, neither did Odysseus. And so the people that made the movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's sort of a comedic replication in 20th century terms, early 20th century terms, of the Odyssey. We're trying to point that out, that we all still live, the archetypal experiences and adventures of Odysseus, and they appear in sometimes humorous ways, which is what that movie did. Okay, I'm not going to be commenting on every line of Pound right now. Dharma, And Pound, what I would say about these lines of Pound that you are pointing to is that, everything has its origins. And what Pound was poetically doing was demonstrating that. And so, as I say, I was talking about Neil deGrasse Tyson at the door of Carl Sagan before he went in the door. He knew at that moment that his life was going to open out from that moment, and it would be a very profound moment for him. And he was right. And that's the way all of our lives work, that something profound happens to us, which causes us to change direction. And, sometimes that something could be not so attractive as being the first day of school as a freshman in college. But, certainly I can say that my life certainly did change direction on January the 4th, 1990, January the 4th, 1990, when I began the decade of the 90s by breaking my leg. And I did that in uniform on the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. And it effectively ended my Marine Corps career. And Edward Edinger would say, that accident was your psyche telling you that that wasn't the path it wanted to follow. And so, if I take it in that way, yes, I agree. And so I had no choice but to follow a different path. And so, what would have happened if Neil deGrasse Tyson had gone to the door of Carl Sagan, and all of a sudden the name Carl Sagan on the door in an illusion had become a monster, or, if he saw into it and saw that it was a monster, then, probably he wouldn't have gone in and his life would have been different. Who can say? So what Dr. Fellows said, it's what I don't care for in poetry, trying to decipher what the author implied. Not always a fun task. You got to be in the mood for riddles. And yeah, I agree with that. But it's also very often the most efficient way to achieve your purposes. And so, many lovers have found that poetry works very well to say something that they can't say outright to someone. Yeah. Okay. So what we're having here is a recitation of certain poetic allusions that Pound or maybe other poets used, and they're great. And so they give example. Would it have been worth it after all, after the cups, the marmalade, and T. And so, depending on how you decide to expend your life and evolve your life going out is your call at any moment. This was Dr. Jung's point about the eternal moment, that in every moment you have to select the best of the alternatives in front of you. And so, I said 5 years ago when I started this YouTube channel that one of my major purposes was that I was sending messages to my grandchildren. I have no idea whether any of them will ever see any of my videos, but I'm hopeful that they will, and I intend to make them aware of them. I have a value in my life that the parents of children have the responsibility to raise their children until the age of 18 when they become adults. But once they become adults, then they can make their own decisions about what their life should be. And so I don't try to impose my views or attitudes on little children. That would be unfair. But, I also know that many of my attitudes have changed dramatically since I was 18 years old. And so once you're 18, you're fair game for me. And I can give you at least my views, and obviously it's up to you to decide whether my views have any substance or value to you or not. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I've been on a lot of rungs and drunk a lot of marmalade and tea, and some of it I have accepted and some of it I have rejected. And Dharma says, we've lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea. Girls wreathe with seaweed red and brown till human voices wake us and we drown. This is from the Prufrock poem. And so we are guided by archetypes, and then we have to decide how they go together. And so for ourselves, and I don't, why am I doing this channel? Well, as I said, one reason was I wanted to leave messages for my grandchildren. And as of today, all of them are under 18, so I don't feel I can say anything to them right now. But this November 4th, the first of them, of 10 of them, but the first of them will become 18. And at that point, I do intend to make him aware of my perspective, which may or may not be the same as his parents' perspective. In this case, I think they probably are quite similar, but there are some cases where they aren't similar. And so next March the 4th, the second grandchild reaches 18, and his parents are relatively fundamentalist Christians, and they have raised their children in largely Christian schools. I know that this particular grandson has been finally allowed to go to civilian public high school. And so maybe he has resisted, the stricture of the Christian education that I don't know about, and I don't feel it's my position to know about that. It's, as I say, it's up to the parents of the children to convey their values to their children. I think a lot of us do things once we reach maturity that we might not have agreed with our parents. I know there are certain aspects of my father's life that I thought should be handled differently, but that was him and I'm me. And so my reaction as a child, as a teenager, to the fact that he didn't follow through on certain dreams, he shared his dreams with me, and then he never followed through. And what that caused me to do is to reject that idea to, if I had a dream or I had a vision of what I should be doing, I definitely have always tried to follow through. And if I found that I was on the wrong path, I often changed my path. Now, that was in some ways foolhardy, but in other ways that it has made me the way I am today. And so in the fullness of 75 years of life, almost, I'll be 75 in less than a month now, I can look back on my life and see that I did certain things. For example, I went to law school, which when I finished college, I never thought I would go to law school. I never thought I would go to business school. I was on my way to a career in the Marine Corps, and I actually had a regular commission, so I was good to go until I was in for 20 years, provided I didn't do something stupid. And after 3 years after my service in Vietnam, I was persuaded to go to law school, or try to. And so I did. And, I decided to apply from Vietnam, and I succeeded in being accepted in law school. So I went to law school, and I liked law school very much. But what I found out was that once I was in the practice of law, I detected the activity. I detested the activity, and I did not want to be a lawyer. And so I started, after 3 years of practicing law, to extricate myself from the practice of law and go on to business school. So I started going to business school and got myself an MBA while I was practicing law, which I did for 5 years. And I never liked it very much, but I did it. But I liked studying. And so I liked business school. And, the irony is that I went to this very quantitatively oriented business school that has produced so many psychotics in business school. But for me, in the businesses that I actually have been involved in throughout my life, I've never found an opportunity to use a statistical regression analysis. The only time I ever did it was at business school. But I learned a few things from business school. None of them were in the classroom. I learned that, if you don't test yourself and test your ability to accomplish something, then you're never going to get anywhere. And so it so happened that one of my mentors in the Marine Corps, a man named Jack Glasgow, was the Marine officer instructor of the NROTC unit at the University of Rochester. And so I met with him for lunch one day. He was halfway through the business school at the time I met him. And I asked him, you're a career Marine officer, why did you go to this business school? And he looked at me right in the eye and he said, so that now nobody can bullshit me. And in my experience, that has worked very well for me, because in the context of business, I know if somebody's trying to fool me or not, which often happens. So you have to be observant. And in one case, I got a D on an economics exam, microeconomics exam, and I was very shocked by that. And one of the beloved professors in that school grabbed the paper out of my hand and took it into his office, had me follow him. And he read it and he started to laugh and he said, well, it's very simple why you got a D here. It's because you answered this question like a lawyer would, but this isn't this isn't law school, this is business school, and we're teaching you microeconomics. So let me show you how microeconomics works. And in like 5 minutes, he taught me how to understand how microeconomics works. And so that was a very valuable lesson. And it taught me that you have to understand the perspective that you're coming from. And then the final thing that I learned, not in the classroom, was that we had a very difficult finance exam. And one of my fellow students was complaining about how difficult this exam was to him. And he was, at that time, he was a 44-year-old vice president of New York Telephone. And he was angry at how difficult the exam was. And the same professor who had advised me about microeconomics said, well, if it wasn't difficult, it wouldn't be worth anything. And that was a point that, business school is difficult and you have to apply yourself to make it. Now I've lost my proper Zoom screen here. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, here. No, I guess that's not it. Just a moment. Okay. Here's the point. My grandson has had the world given to him. His father is a radiologist, so has a good income, and his mother is my daughter, and she's had a broad experience in life. She grew up in part in Japan in an expatriate community, and so she saw a lot of the world. And I sent her to India one time for 5 weeks, and so she saw life in India. And so he has a broad experience, plus his he's Korean American, and his father was born in Korea. And so he has broad experience based on that, for which will set him in good stead for his life. He's had great grades and so on. And he, and right now he's sort of flown through. He's a very smart kid. He's got straight A's, or almost a straight A, performance in his private school, and he's the captain of the lacrosse team. So he has a bright future. But what I have to make him sensitive to once he's 18 is that the world is not as simple as a lacrosse tournament or a lacrosse game. Any game that you care to look at, whether it's football or chess or lacrosse, it has a limited number of rules, and you play on a known playing field, and you develop skills that allow you to perform on that field. But when you get out into life, life is much more complicated. I once knew a man who was the national collegiate champion in speed chess, and that's a chess game in 10 minutes. And so he was really smart as a whip. He would walk in the room and the whole place would light up with his intelligence. But he treated his partners poorly in business. And the result of that was that he lost much of his business at one point that I knew him. And the point is that, yes, you can learn 16 billion chess moves. I guess there's about 16 billion possibilities of how a game would play through. But that's based on it's based on a checkerboard of 64 squares, and it's based on cards, players that have limited things that they can do. But the problem that he faced was that human beings tend to be a little bit more complicated than chess pieces, and they react differently. And if you don't understand that and understand how you have to react, then you're going to be left flat-footed all the time. And so, as I used to say it, human beings tend to wiggle a bit more than a chess piece. And so, knowing, being successful on the lacrosse field or on a chess game is not the same as being successful in life and being happy in life. And so you really need to learn what makes for a happy life. Because if you're totally committed to the logos, then you end up with dissatisfaction in life. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I'll share my image that proves that. Okay, so this is my demonstration of what happens if you live your life by the logos. Okay, so this is a 64-foot motor yacht, and the name of this motor yacht is Never Enough. And the point is that you can have a materialistic output or outlook that you're going to, if you achieve success, then you're going to be able to purchase a boat like this. But, I didn't purchase a boat quite this big, but I did, with a partner, purchase a smaller power boat at one point, and we took it out into the Chesapeake Bay. And the first thing we said to one another as we went out into the sort of moderately heavy water of the Chesapeake Bay, which is behind me in this image, is we need a bigger boat. And our boat was less than half the size of this boat. And the point is that, if you're in a hurricane, a boat like this wouldn't do anything for you. You would be just as much as at risk as I would have been. And so that's a material thing. And just because you own it, and that owner wasn't on his boat using it, so he was not having any of the pleasure that could be associated with that boat. And so that it would make a difference in his life, he achieved it. But as he said in the name of his boat, it's never enough. And so what you have to learn is that life doesn't work based on who's got the most toys. That was the fallacy that was presented in the sort of 70s and 80s of the 20th century, that whoever dies with the most toys wins. Well, no, you don't win if you have the most toys, because the toys don't make you happy. You can't ever satisfy a child's desire for more toys. If you take them to the toy store, they'll want everything. and if they bring it home and they play with it once, then they might not want it anymore. And so the point is that you have to learn how to live a happy life. And so our former president is the poster boy for that, where he has gotten all of the things that one as an American could probably achieve in the materialistic sense. He's got a building named for him, and he's got a trophy wife, and he's been president of the United States, and he's got a big estate in Florida. But is he happy? That's the question. And my point is that I've never seen him smile. I've never seen him enjoy his life. He's always trying to get something else. And if you live your life that way, you're very likely not going to live a happy life. And he actually got a trophy wife 3 times, and none of them have satisfied him. It's quite obvious that he and Melania are estranged, and so we need other aspirations in our lives than physical things. That's my point, I guess. And so anyway, with that, and because unfortunately my partner didn't make it today, I guess I'll wrap up because my voice is dying. And what I want to emphasize is that I am reading this book, Alchemy, into the YouTube channel. And even if you don't buy the book, I urge you to listen to my reading, because it is going to inform you far more than anything that I could say to you. And especially when I get to chapter 5. That's truly profound. And I'm going to read it straight through. So today I'm going to, hopefully, if I can get my voice back this afternoon, I'll read the Q&A for chapter 2, and I'll keep going in the remainder of this month. Maybe I can finish it. And I think if you did nothing else on this YouTube channel, that would be a valuable experience. And so I am urging you to go listen to it now. At the end of the month, I'm going to start monetizing it. So there will be advertisement on it after I've gotten the whole thing online. I will start to monetize it. So this is your warning that if you want to listen to it without advertisement, please listen to it now, because I think you'll find it very valuable. So thank you very much for being with me today. And I have to go give my voice rest. So peace, take care. Thank you for being here. Let me just look at whatever. Well, Big Cat says, my life has been an epic failure. And I would simply say that, so why don't you make a success of it from now with the best of the possibilities? I have no idea who you are, where you live, or what you envision your failures, but all of my mistakes have led me to different places and states in my psyche. And, I feel very strongly that I'm a happy person now. And even though I've had many things go wrong for me in my life in many ways, nonetheless, I have achieved what others would consider successes. I mean, I have started a company on my back porch, which was taken public in 2005. And I'm working with another company now, which may become a public company. And so that satisfies me in the logos sense. But, I've also had epic failures, but they have allowed me to live a happy life. And so your question, your evaluation of your life as an epic failure, maybe you should consider it as epic preparation for what you're going to do next, and then figure out what that's going to be. And, this was Dr. Jung's point in the eternal moment. In every moment, we stand at a point where we have to choose the best of the possibilities. And if we do that, then, you might not end up where you dreamed you would as a child, but at least you can be much happier than a statement like, my life has been an epic failure would suggest. And so I urge you to look into that. Big Cat says statistical regression analysis is really fun. Well, okay, I'll concede your point to a certain extent, because I did do it in business school. The problem is that I never found a a statistical population big enough in my business life to run a statistical analysis on it. And so unless you're going to work for a Fortune 500 company and you get happiness by running regression analysis for the CEO, you might, knowing that you're able to do it is one thing, and I was able to do it. But in actual business, since I was 32 years old, I haven't been able to find a single time when I needed it. and so I know how people try to use it against me, but I see their calumny from the beginning. And so yeah, Dr. Fell, I'm not going to show your one of your comments here because it's not appropriate for here. You can take your political position elsewhere. And I'm going to leave your position on the election there. However, I would say that time will tell, and I do not agree with you. And please do not use my chat on my YouTube channel as a means to spread political propaganda of that kind. If you continue to do it, you will be banned from this YouTube channel. Go create your own if that's what you have in mind. And one says there are more moves in chess than storms in the universe. Well, that may well be true, but there are more storms in the human species than even that. Yeah, so anyway, okay, I've run out of steam here, so I'll see you next week. Hopefully my discussion partner will be able to join me next week. And if not, we will proceed on with something. And I generally have been using this period on Sunday morning as a way to do Q&A and share some of my personal experiences for what they're worth. And I seem to have a following for it, which I'm grateful for. And so I'm going to continue to do it that way for the time being. And on Mondays now, we're going to move away from the tarot and start talking about the 2 essays on psychotherapy, which Dr. Jung wrote as volume 7 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And so, please join me for that on that channel. And I'm hoping that that channel, which is my Monday night, 8 p.m. Discussion, is going to evolve into a further Q&A time with me that will be helpful to some, maybe not all. If you're going to try to sell psychedelics on my website, or you're going to try to sell party propaganda, then you probably should find another place and create your own website, because I'm not going